Hey guys, here is your imaginary and complex numbers. This is your ACT prep module. So this is just going to be some actually technical skills. Not a lot of big thought, but you do need to understand what's going on here. When you're solving quadratic equations, you can't always guarantee they'll stay in the real number system. Also true in higher degrees. I is defined as the square root of -1. So every negative number under a square root sign can be written as -1 times the number. Recall, square root of 25 equals 5. If you have the square root of -25, you can rewrite it as 25 times the square root of -1, which equals 5, which is what you got out of here, times the I, which is our definition here, or 5i. Okay, so this one you would have the square root of -16 would be the square root of 4 times the square root of -1, which would be 4i. You always got to remember that -1 equals I. Okay, so you've probably figured out the pattern now. That negative makes the I, and the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 49 is 7, and that negative would be an I. Square root of 36 is 6. Square root of that -1 would be I. Okay? And as long as you've just got this, that is going to just be a positive for I. It's only when you throw the x in there and you're solving an equation that you would get a plus or minus for the square root. If that is just a problem, you're just evaluating that. You're not solving any kind of equation. Okay, sometimes the numbers will need to be factored before a perfect square appears. Okay, so for example, square root of -50 is not a perfect square, but it will factor into the square root of -25 and 2. So in that case, you would have 5 times I, because that's what the square root of -25 is. We just had that on our last one. It's 5i. Times the square root of 2. That's going to stay under because there isn't a perfect square of that. So your answer is going to be 5i times the square root of 2. -72 also works. The first one I see is 9 times 8. 8 also splits into 4 times 2. So I've got two perfect squares there. You can multiply them together and get a square root of -36 times square root of 2. So that's going to end up being 6i times the square root of 2. Okay? It will break down if you want it to. All right, if you don't see this, it's very simple. You can always just do it. The square root of -9 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. That would give you 3i. Square root of 4 is 2, and then your square root of 2. So you would still end up with 6i times the square root of 2. You would just do 2 instead of the 1. That is fine. Okay, here we've got 3 times the square root of -16, which is 3 times 4i, or 12i. This is negative times the square root of -25 times the square root of 3. Notice I always put the negative with the perfect square so that when I get it, I can just pull it right out. 5i times the square root of 3. So you'd end up with -5i and then the square root of 3 on the side. Okay? Square roots of negative numbers, we're still going. This is throwing in a little bit of your variables, so you need to remember those. These right here are problems on our note quiz. I'm going to do one of these just for the variables to remind you of that. This square root of -125 is the square root of -25 times the square root of 5. And then you've got the square root of We take these out as 2's because if it's a square root, I need 2 of these to bring 1 out. So that would be x squared, 2 of them, x squared, 2 more of them, and then 1x is left. So this right here is 5i. This is the square root of 5. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of x squared is x. And then you've got a square root of x left. So this is going to be 5i times x squared. And then you have the square root of 5x. And this would just be written all together. 5ix squared, square root of 5x. And that is actually your answer. If I had had x to the 6th, I wouldn't have had any x's left under there. But that's just so you know. All right, I comes in groups of 4. So to find I to the 542, you would have to figure out where in the groups of 4 it is. And it's out off your chart here. You can't see it. You just need to know the remainder is the word that's down there. Okay, and this would be a remainder of 1, which is 0.25. So if it's 4, you got 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and a whole. Okay? So right here, if you just divide that out, 540, say screen, 542 divided by 4, there we go. You can see right off the bat which it would be. 542 divided by 4. Oops, I keep hitting that x. I mean it equals. You got 135.5. So 0.5 would be 2/4, which means it's going to go on the x squared version. Okay, I mean the I squared version, which is -1. If you are trying to remember these, I always think of it as I1, and these middle two are negative. Okay? I1, the middle two are negative. All right? So if you do that to yourself, you can write it right up in the corner. Whenever they ask you what is I to the 798th, you can divide that straight out, and it gives you, do 798 divided by 4. Divided by 4, which gives you 199.5, another 2/4. So that means it's going to be another -1. I to the 542 is, in fact, -1 also. Okay, products of pure imaginary numbers. These 3 right here, I'm getting ready to do for you, but these problems down here are the problems on your notes quiz. -2i times 7i would give you -14i squared. -14 and I squared is -1. Okay. -14 times -1 is +14. -10 times -15. Okay, well that is I times the square root of 10 times I times the square root of 15. Oh, took it the negative. I was confusing myself right there. Sorry. You've got an I times the square root of 15, just like I said, didn't write. So I times I is I squared, and that's the square root of 150. I squared is -1, just like we had before. This is going to be the square root of 25 times the square root of 6. So you're going to have -1 times 5 times the square root of 6, or negative 5 times the square root of 6. Okay. I to the 45th, you are going to divide that by 4. So you put it in the calculator, 45 divided by 4, which is actually 11.25. So that is 1/4. It's just like I, which means it's I. I1. The first thing is I. So these down here are to check that you know how to do these, and I'm giving you examples exactly like these are. So that's what's working on your notes quiz. All right, you can also solve equations using imaginary numbers. You just have to do what you're doing. Move it over. 3x squared equals negative 48. Divide by 3, and you get x squared equals negative 16. This is when you're taking a square root of an x. So that's when you're going to get the positive or negative for I, just like you had before. Okay? So, you've got to make sure you know what you're doing there. But, just remember your positive or negative, same thing that you had before for I. Right here, you're going to take a square root of both sides. So, x equals, the square root of 81 is positive or negative 9i, because that's going to equal the negative 81, positive 81 times the square root of negative 1. Give you your 9i. All right, we got one more. I'm going to call it on this one and get to video 2. Let's subtract 75 off both sides. So you have 3x squared equals negative 75. Divide through by 3. And you have x squared equals negative 25. Take a square root of both sides. And x is going to equal positive or negative. That's because the square root of x squared is actually the absolute value of x. So you're going to have a positive or negative 5i. All right, so that'll hold us for the first part of this. And I'll see you in a minute.